Alrighty, and we already have a volunteer here for an opening prayer, so let's get started.
Dear Heavenly Father, we are thankful that we are able to have this meeting tonight, and we are thankful for the equipment which is making it work better, and for the good connection. Please bless that your spirit will be with us throughout the meeting, and please bless that your spirit will be with Kevin and his daughter while he is helping him move. Please bless that everything will go according to thy will, and in the name of Yeshua Messiah, Amen.
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 There's Chris. Alrighty, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about King Benjamin's speech in the beginning of Mosiah. I did not have a specific point that I wanted to make. I just kind of wanted to have it as have a discussion about it, or use it as to spark a discussion, or so everybody is allowed to, you know, join in with a comment if they would like. And I just would like, I just wanted to have a bit of a discussion about it because because I think it brings up a lot of good doctrine. So, a little bit of background, if you haven't read this part recently, uh, it doesn't go into much detail, but it says that, the Nephites at the time had just gone through some conflict. There was some, there were some wars and conflict with the Lamanites, and King Benjamin said that he's been leading them through it as best as he can. Now, I also like this speech because uh, if you've read the Book of Mormon at all, you realize that it operates in cycles. There's always, they're good, then they start going bad, and then something happens like a war or an invasion or a disaster of some sort, and then they turn themselves back towards the Lord, and then after a period of peace, then things start going bad again. Now, the way I see it, I think that King Benjamin actually did a pretty good job because this right here is after the wars and contentions were over with, he got his people together and when he's old, it doesn't say how much time has passed since then, but it feels like to me since he wasn't it says he after a time he got old, that feels to me that he knows that it's about the time of the cycle when they start going bad again, or they or something like or they start getting puffed up with their pride, and they start you know comparing each other and trying to gain more wealth or influence or power or anything along those lines. I think that's it. Oh no, he's still there. So King Benjamin gathers everybody together to try and uh, put that off for a little bit longer. And if you've read through it, then you know that he kind of succeeds because all of his people, it says later on that all of his people, uh, re-swear themselves to the Lord. They all vow to live to the Lord. And then, and then he passes the kingdom to Mosiah. And Mosiah's actual bit in in the book of Mosiah is actually very small. I forget exactly how long it is, but you know, King Ben or I don't know, I can't I'm not gonna scroll all the way down to find it. But anyway, King Mosiah does a fairly good job, and it's only uh after him. It's I forget the other king the one was Noah one of Mosiah's sons, or I forget now.
Um, I didn't think he was an actual son, but
Yeah, but yeah,
he was after they went to.
yeah, or they get invaded or something again.
They went back. King Noah was after they went back to their original inheritance, and then they had set up. He was the son of the other guy who was first went back there.
Right. So yeah, King Mosiah did a pretty good job as well, and so that's nearly a whole generation of uh of Nephites living uh a pretty good society. So I'd say he did pretty good. But um yeah, I don't know if I should just start reading the speech or
Sure.
I don't know. It's And these are the words which he spake and caused to be written, saying, My brethren, all ye that have assembled them yourselves together, you that can hear my words which I shall speak unto you this day. For I have not commanded you to come up hither to trifle with words which I shall speak, but that you shall hearken unto me. And open your ears that ye may hear, and your hearts that ye may understand, and your minds that the mysteries of God may be unfolded to your view. I have not commanded you to come up hither that ye should fear me, or that ye should think that I of myself am more than a mortal man. But I am, like as yourselves, subject to all manner of infirmities in the mind, in the body and mind. Yet as I have been chosen by this people, and this was consecrated by my father, and was consecrated by my father, and was suffered by the hand of the Lord that I should be a ruler and a king over this people. And I have kept and preserved, and have been kept and preserved by his matchless power, to serve thee with all the might, mind, and strength with the Lord, which the Lord hath given me, granted me. I'm not doing very well right now. Yeah.
You want me to read some of it?
I can keep going a little bit more. I say unto you that as I have been suffered to spend my days in your service, even up to this time, and have not sought gold nor silver, nor no manner of riches of you, neither have I suffered that ye should be confined in dungeons, nor that ye should make slaves one with another, or that ye should plunder, or that ye should murder, or plunder, or steal, or commit adultery, or even I have not suffered that ye should commit any manner of wickedness, and have taught you that ye should keep the commandments of the Lord, in all the things which he hath commanded you. And even I myself have labored with mine own hands that I might serve you, and that ye should not be laden with taxes, and that there should nothing come upon you which was grievous to be borne. And all these things which I have spoken, ye yourselves are witnesses this day. How many politicians can say that nowadays?
That's right. Pretty
Uh,
nice. He's just like, I got my own job. I don't need to tax you guys.
yep.
There would have to been some kind of help somewhere if they were building stuff for the public.
Yeah, but odds are it was, hey, let's everybody get together and build this road. I'll bring the first shovel.
There you go. That would be good.
Yeah. So obviously he's yeah, he's been doing a pretty good job as king. He, he continues, Yet, my brethren, I have not done these things that I might boast, neither do I tell these things that thereby I might accuse you, but I tell you these things that ye may know that I can answer a clear conscience before God this day. And it's like, yeah, That's almost a brag. It's like I know my conscience is clean. How about you?
Good question. How about any of us?
Yeah, that's a good one because you know, yeah, I kind of like where it goes in here. Behold, I say unto you that because I said unto you that I had spent my days in your service, I do not desire to boast, for I have only been in the service of God. And behold, I tell you these things, that ye may learn wisdom, that ye may learn that, when ye are in the service of your fellow beings, ye are only in the service of your God. Behold, ye have called me your king, and if I, whom ye called your king, do labor to serve you, then had ye not ought to labor to serve one another. Now, I think this tells me why he called this meeting, because of that same cycle that you know they have peace, which means they get prosperous, which means they start getting a higher standard of living. Things get easier, and so people start getting greedy. They start wanting wealth, or as they say, wearing costly apparel, or all these things. Boom. So, from what I see, is that King Benjamin can see this is starting to happen to his people. He sees that this is starting to, uh, people are starting to get ideas of who's richer, who, excuse me, who's more prosperous. So he's really trying to humble them, trying to get them to look around and think, hey, if the king who's led us. Remember, there has been, invasions and wars and contention in the land, as they call it, and King Benjamin has led them through this. And so he's obviously a very well-respected guy. And so as it says, you know that I've done all these things. You know that I've never caused you to have a lot of taxes, or I've never forced you to do things, or I've never thrown you in dungeons and that sort of thing. So it's this guy has a well earned reputation. So most of his speech here is all about curbing that pride and that greed that is starting to come up to his people. Because I don't know, you
Well,
have
I would
any?
agree. I think it's just the beginning here. And as he goes on, he brings their mind and their hearts back to the Lord so much that they are willing to recommit themselves to the Lord and rededicate their lives to the Lord. So I think he,
Yeah, so that's, I mean, yeah, he starts out saying, this is my credentials. This is why you should listen to me, because I've labored throughout my entire life to serve you, and you know this, you've seen it, you've seen me work right alongside you, and there's no there's no politician in him. He's never acted like a politician, and so everybody can know this. And so he starts there, and he starts working them. Uh,
well,
start,
psychologically, just through human nature, this would be, he would have to have a great deal of background that he could prove himself to be a great servant to them in order to even do this. Otherwise, human nature would dictate that no one would even come to listen to his speech if he did not have a status. Uh, he'd have to be wealthy, popular, all that kind of stuff for anybody to even come and listen to his speech. So just the fact that they all came, this guy would have been a great leader. He
yeah,
would have had to do it because if he didn't get taxes, And if he didn't like
If he didn't have taxes, it
they
means he's got no army, which means there's no threat of force. It's like your king has demanded you come uh and jo come to this big meeting. There was none of that because he didn't have an army.
well,
He sent his son Mosiah out to go
so
uh,
why did people listen? I mean, if he
because
didn't
he was
confine them to dungeons, that shows that he wasn't compelling the people, at least by that much force. And if he had the didn't have taxes, then he couldn't compel the people in that way either. So how did he get them to listen? I mean, he said, "I didn't suffer that you would commit adultery." Good luck with that.
yeah, well,
How did the
obviously
people listen? He would have had
he
some kind of
has
influence.
there is a system of laws in place. So, he says
There is.
that he didn't confine them into dungeons or anything, but there is obviously still a system of laws and everything in place because he says, I didn't allow you to just kill as you please. So, but it seems to me that he has led a lot by example and by a point, I don't know if at this point in time, they didn't really have the system of judges, uh,
No, it was done by the king, but still.
but they would have had some sort of official in various towns and places.
Well,
Or
they would have had the system of judges already set up because that's what Mosiah proposed, only to do it publicly, and he proposed how to manage it. So the king would have had his
yeah, so
officers or
so
people
the
holding different positions because you can't run a country all with one person.
yeah, but it's they all those officials or whatever they would be called, they all took their cues from the king. Like obviously, if
They would have to follow those particular rules.
yeah,
And they were also still under the law of Moses at the time. So there were punishments and rewards already in place just from that law.
yeah, yeah. Don't forget anybody can jump in anytime if they have a comment. But if
He
not,
would have had to have been very skilled or talented or something at what he was doing in order for to have that much influence over the people.
yeah,
So
yeah,
nowadays it's all done by, threat of violence, like a policeman with a gun, or, or a threat of putting in prison the rest of your life, or a threat of anything. Or giving you a fine that would take you 100 lifetimes to pay off, or
yeah,
or or there had to be money involved somehow, popularity, peer pressure, all that kind of stuff. So he must have had some talent.
yeah, yeah. Although it also says earlier on, it says that they brought their lambs and their first fruits as the sacrifice. So obviously he planned this around the festival, about around
Of course.
the festival.
And they
So
gathered at the temple. The tower was built there at the temple.
it wasn't like he's disrupting everybody's day. This was already a festival day. But yeah, and of course he continues. And behold, also, if I, who ye call your king, who has spent his days in your service, and yet hath been in the service of God, doth merit any thanks from you, how had ye ought to thank your heavenly king? I'm just gonna grab my water here.
Occupy. I say unto you, my brethren, that if you should render all the thanks and praise which your whole souls have power to possess to that God who hath created you, and hath kept and preserved you, and hath caused that you ye should rejoice, and hath granted that ye should live in peace one with another. I say unto you that if ye should serve him who hath created you from the beginning, and art preserving you from day to day, by lending you breath that ye may live and move and do according to your own will, and even supporting you from one moment to another, I say, if ye should serve him with all your whole soul, and yet ye would be unprofitable servants.
Yeah, I like that line. Just to make sure that nobody's getting any sort of pride again. It's like you could spend your whole life serving God and you could do everything perfectly, and yet you would still not be able to pay back what he has invested in you.
No kidding. And behold, all that he requires of you is to keep his commandments. And he hath promised you that if you would keep his commandments, ye should prosper in the land. And he never doth vary from that which he hath said. Therefore, if ye do keep his commandments, he doth bless you and prosper you.
I like this next line.
And now, in the first place, he hath created you and granted unto you your lives, for which ye are indebted unto him. And secondly, he doth require that ye should do as he hath commanded you, for which if ye do, he doth immediately bless you. And therefore he hath paid you, and ye are still indebted unto him, and art and will be forever and ever. Therefore, of what have ye to boast?
Yeah, I like that line because it's like, and you can't pay him back because whenever you do something right, you immediately get the results of that action, and
Yeah, no kidding.
so you immediately you get the karma or the results or the consequences of doing right, and therefore you are still not paying him back anything because he's immediately paying you.
Yeah,
That was I don't
absolutely.
know. That's one of my favorite lines of that speech of this speech. It's like you ain't nothing.
Well,
Yeah, you already owe him so much, and the minute you do anything even slightly remotely good, you get rewarded for it. So you're not really paying anything off.
no kidding. It's definitely an interesting concept. Shall we continue?
Sure, I can read if you want.
Sure.
And now I ask, can ye say aught of yourselves? I answer you, nay. Ye cannot say that thou art even as much as the dust of the earth. Yet thou wast created of the dust of the earth. But behold, it belongeth to him who created you. So it's again that stop being so prideful. It's really hammering in that you're really not worth much of anything. So stop pretending you are. So stop reaching for riches and this pride and greed that he's very clearly preaching against because it reminds
Well,
me
only
of the
vain
other.
people would ever think that they're worth so much. I mean, they're the ones whose hearts get pricked every time they hear something like that. All the humble people, it's like, well, yeah, of course. But only the vain people really think odd, think against that.
Yep. And I, even I, whom ye call your king, am no better than ye yourselves are, for I am also of the dust. And thou beholdest that I am old, and am about to yield up this mortal frame to its mother earth. Therefore, as I said unto you that I had served you, walking with a clear conscience before God, even so, I at this time have caused that ye should assemble yourselves together, that I might be found blameless, and that your blood should not come upon me, when I shall stand to be judged of God of all the things whereof he hath commanded me concerning you. Now,
Well, that's nice. You know that he has had revelation of what he needs to be doing. for the people, right? What God has
Yeah,
commanded him to do
God
for the
has
people.
very clearly commanded him to call this assembly and everything else. I say unto you that I have caused that ye should assemble yourselves together, that I might rid my garments of your blood at this period of time when I am about to go down to my grave, that I might go down in peace, and in my immortal spirit may join the choirs above in singing the praises of a just God. Now, yeah, because obviously it's like you might have stayed good for my lifetime, but I didn't want to risk it, so I'll make sure it's
Mm.
uh, just to give them, well, one last teaching so that they can, so that he can truly say, I did everything that I can for these people. And it obviously worked because they spent another generation being decent people. And moreover, I say unto you that I have caused that ye should assemble yourselves together, that I might declare unto you that I can no longer be your teacher nor your king. For even at this time my whole frame doth tremble exceedingly, while attempting to speak unto you. But the Lord God doth support me, and hath suffered me that I should speak unto you, and hath commanded me that I should declare unto you this day that my son Mosiah is a king and a ruler over you. Now, this is also a thing because everybody can see that he's old, and yet he's up on top of this tower yelling for everybody to hear. And, even if he can't yell quite as loud as he used to, and he has to, send runners out to with, his words written down on them. But it's it's a lot of the fact is that everybody knows this guy. He's got his reputation, but also probably a personal relationship with a lot of people because he's their king and their teacher. It's his job to go out and teach people and lead them whenever they need it. So he's very much, and obviously, God. They can see that God also supports. That they can see that God supports him, and so they can also see that God supports Moses or Mosiah.
Messiah.
So I don't know. He's a pretty good speaker as well.
Yeah, no kidding.
He knows how to do this sort of stuff. And now, my brethren, I would that ye should do as ye hath hitherto done, as ye have kept my commandments, and also the commandments of my father, and have prospered and have been kept from falling into the hands of your enemies. Even so, if ye shall keep the commandments of my Son, or the commandments of God, which shall be delivered unto you by him, ye shall prosper in the land, and your enemies shall have no power over you. So this is also a thing because even though, the Nephites and Lamanites are fairly separate, I don't think I mean, news still travels because obviously they're not completely separate because every time we hear the talk about the Nephites and the Lamanites, and it's like the Lamanites heard this about the Nephites. Well, somebody's got to be talking. So there's still going to be this. And if King Benjamin was such a good military leader as well, then obviously the people might be a little bit worried that, when he dies, the Lamanites might try to invade again. Or like he says, their enemies might try to invade. But he's trying to tell them that it wasn't me. It was the fact that you were keeping the commandments and you lived properly. And if you listen to my son, who is also his job is to tell you the commandments, then you'll still be living properly.
Well, we find out throughout the Book of Mormon that they actually had traditions about how they would choose kings. And if they were righteous, they would always choose a king who also had the spirit of revelation, spirit of prophecy. And and of course they had a succession of kings, which you could see like his dad, Mosiah, and Benjamin, and his son Mosiah, that they had both the talent in getting revelation and prophecy and things in order to lead their armies against their enemies. And it would be he's telling them, Mosiah's got that gift. So,
Yeah.
if you listen to him,
What was that one it was just like the one line, and it said that it was much later on, but it said, and as was the custom to choose a general who could hear the voice of the Lord and tell us where to go. And it's like that's a that's a very big thing for just being for being a throwaway line. And
yeah,
it's like
it's huge.
because even when their rulers started to get corrupt, they were still smart enough to know to choose to have someone nearby who could actually hear the voice of the Lord and see the future or uh, 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 something along those lines.
Of course.
And I don't know. I always thought that was a little bit funny. Even once their chief judge position started becoming like a king and they started getting corrupt and all that stuff, they still knew enough to keep somebody who knew the truth nearby just in case they need him.
Absolutely.
Uh, so yeah. Any comments so far?
It's a
No.
new story.
It's, it's just it's the same story. Although sometimes I get these two speeches mixed up, like King Benjamin's speech on the tower and was it Jacob's speech on when he went up on a tower, or was it Joseph? I can't remember now.
Well,
But
Jacob does give a speech earlier on in the book, and then don't forget Mosiah will give a speech later.
I don't know. All these speeches, and they all say the same thing, so it's
Of course, they're all the same,
yeah,
based on the same principles.
yeah. But O my people, beware lest there shall arise contentions among you, and ye list ye list to obey the evil spirit, which was spoken of by my father Mosiah. For behold, there is a woe pronounced upon him who listeth to obey that spirit. For people who don't know, listing is a nautical term. It's a boating. It's when you're taking on water on one side and you're tilting and leaning to one direction. It doesn't have to be taking on water, but whatever the cause, it's when you're leaning to one direction without entirely meaning to. It's usually caused by something heavy dragging on that side, or like something obstructing that side,
Yeah,
or if the
or your
wind is blowing
cargo,
the wrong way or the cargo's
your ship
shifted.
shifts, and
So I think that's an interesting, what do you call it? It's an interesting word to use to obey to you list to obey that evil spirit, because because most people don't do it with a conscious purpose. They they
well, it
slide.
shows
They
it shows that you actually have chosen that way. There are certain things that you're choosing in your life that
yeah.
weigh to that side and causes you.
Yeah, you may not consciously see the end point of what you're leading to, but you're choosing to do stuff that's leading you down a path that really is not the best path.
Yeah, well, for example, an easy way to look at it today is if you have a certain tendency, a certain addiction to something, you know, if I don't know, say you like to eat ice cream, you eat it every single day, and you're starting to
Yeah.
starting to list forward, climb out of bed and miss the floor, that kind of thing. But no, what about any other thing? You may have a certain tendency towards something that you enjoy, but it's not really considered an evil necessarily, but the tendency toward it does, uh, weigh on that side.
Yeah.
And therefore, you justify and overlook other behaviors that are not appropriate. And pretty soon, you start tilting so far that way that
You
you,
can't turn back.
you turn worldly,
Yeah.
you sink.
Well, for the way these things usually happen in the Book of Mormon, it's usually uh well, it's pride and money because it starts out with like, oh well, I'm working extra hard and I'm accumulating a little bit more savings, and saving and being prepared is good, and so well, I'll just work harder, but pretty soon you're thinking, well, I don't want to spend my money to help this other guy because it's my savings. I might need it. And then, as it goes,
And
listing.
even the more and more time you spend working for that, the more out of balance your life becomes, the
Yeah,
more that takes
spending
over.
more time at work and not teaching your children or everything
And you
else.
miss out on the point of this earth, and before you know it, you're old and you have not accomplished what you were brought here to accomplish.
Yeah,
People, that is a big one that happens today all the time. People get so addicted to work and comfort and money and having something that they miss out on all the progression they could have made.
yeah,
They really, and they swear up and down that they need to do it, that it's a necessary evil, and they're so addicted to it that they actually think that there's something good there to be found.
yeah. Or they say they want to provide for their children, but they are never around their children. And their children grow up and it's like, yeah, yeah, my dad's got money, whatever.
It ruins families, it ruins generations.
Yeah, which is why he's
Well, look
preaching
at
so
Layman
hard
and Lemuel.
against
We
it.
talked about this a few weeks ago, remember?
Yeah, Laman and
Layman and
Lemuel
Lemuel.
grew up when their father was busy making money. And so they grew up thinking that, money was important and their social status was important. And that's how they grew up. And we know what happened to them. And
Well,
so,
let's even point it out a little differently. If Layman and Lemuel had stayed in the city, they would have behaved appropriately for that society. They wouldn't have necessarily killed somebody here or there or whatever because they wanted that status. They wanted people to look at them in a certain way.
yeah,
So
they,
they
they,
may not have become as extreme in their behavior. And we see this today all the time. People think, well, we're not like Layman and Lemuel, but your children turned worldly and it doesn't matter if they keep going to the synagogue or keep going to the church or whatever. They've turned so worldly that they have no connection with God.
yep. And then if they do get taken out of their their society or the culture that they were raised in, then they start going bad because
They already are bad.
well,
It's just
yeah,
they claim that they're not because they see everybody else being the same way. They think that's the way the world is, and it is, but it doesn't have to be that way.
yeah. Well, I mean, uh, they as what do you say? It's they have no Well, they have no connection to the Lord, so that when things get hard for them, there is they always go farther and farther to the extreme. I mean, because there's no there's they can never be good during an extreme situation. They will spaz, they will panic, they will go extremely evil, uh, because they have nothing. Their anchor was all this worldly and was only in the world. And so when the world shifted, they shifted with it. But people who are anchored in, you know, to God, to the commandments, to goodness, when extreme things happen, they just keep on going. They keep on being good.
Of course.
And yeah, that's why they always seem to well, it's the difference between the Lamanites and the Nephites. It's the whole thing that, when they first landed on this thing, the Lamanites were getting worse and worse and worse, whereas the Nephites kept, they planted a garden, they grew a farm, they lived just like anybody else, just like they would have if they were there, because there was no. It doesn't matter what the worldly situation is if you're anchored to the Lord, if you're anchored to being good.
Of course. We really have to, the whole concept of like you started with the listing, it does refer back to how a boat operates. And it refers back to specific cargo shifting and moving when the waves come, the winds
Yeah.
blow, because that's when the waves are tilting the boat or whatever it may be, the cargo shifts. And he's trying to point out what cargo you have in there right now. And he's pointing out of these, uh, all these vices that he's pointing out, and that is the cargo that is within you. And so you have these things within you, some of them that you have a tendency toward that you may not think are causing you too much trouble. But when the storms come, like you're saying, when something happens in life, then it shifts and it causes your downfall, it causes you to sink. And so it's very difficult because you cannot shift it back once it shifts
Yeah,
in a storm. You can't shift it
you
back.
can't shift your cargo in a storm. You will just get yourself crushed.
Yeah. And there's no way to shift it because the boat's tilted.
Yeah.
You can't walk
So
on a
you
tilted boat, and so you can't shift it.
yeah,
So it's very, they're trying to use that analogy for the people, for us, those things we have within our hearts or within our minds.
yeah.
If, like you were talking about, to to earn money, it could be that you originally began to take care of your family, but then you saw a little bit of a storm and you thought, well, maybe I should have a little extra, saved up so that just in case the storm comes again, just in case there's some problem. And then maybe I should have a little bit for this and a little bit for that. Maybe I should have this kind of insurance, that kind of insurance. Maybe I should be getting, upkeep on this and that. I need fancier clothes. I have to make better business deals. I need this, I need that. And pretty soon it takes over. But when a storm does come in those situations, that it will shift
Yeah.
and it will cause your downfall. And we have seen it over and over and over again. Many times. A person doesn't have to be wealthy. It's just the drive for that's where your focus of your life is. Put too much emphasis on it. Your happiness depends too much on, maybe the results of those things
Yeah.
where it should not rule over your life. You're missing out on your life.
Yeah.
And it becomes an excess.
Yeah. And
And so it shifts.
yeah. And it says it very clearly. For if he listeth to obey him, and remaineth and dieth in his sins, the same drinketh damnation to his own soul. For he receiveth his for his wages an everlasting punishment, having transgressed the law of God, contrary to his own knowledge.
Your boat sunk.
Yeah. Well, it's the if you're going here and your boat starts listing, you end up here. Now, that may not be a big difference, except when the map is this big. So here to here is a different country. And once you wind up in the wrong country, you're in a lot of trouble.
Oh, yeah. Because they have their own King Benjamin over there.
Yeah. And he continues, it says, I say unto you that there are not one among you, except it be your little children, that have not been taught concerning these things. But what knowledge that
What
ye,
knoweth?
but what knoweth that But one knoweth that ye are eternally indebted to your heavenly Father, to render to him all that ye have and are, and also have been taught concerning the records which contain the prophecies which hath been spoken by the holy prophets, even down to the time our father Lehi left Jerusalem, and also all that hath been spoken by our fathers until now. And behold, also they spake that which was commanded of them of the Lord. Therefore they are just and true. So it's again, it's like, you know, you are condemned based on what you taught, and I know you know this because I taught every single one of you this.
He would have been a teacher and given speeches at every festival, every feast day that they had.
Yeah,
So he would have taught them.
yeah, and he didn't just like teach them a little bit. It says he taught them the whole scriptures that they had, and so it was not. He was a good teacher.
Certainly.
And now I say unto you, my brethren, that after ye have known and have been taught all these things, if ye should transgress and go contrary to that which hath been spoken, that ye do withdraw yourselves from the Spirit of the Lord, that it may have no place in you to guide you in wisdom's paths, that ye may be blessed, prospered, and preserved. So it's like I also like this because because obviously he has been teaching them and they have been, for the most part living this and they have seen the results of this. They have been blessed, they have prospered, and they have been prospered and they have been preserved because they knew that the enemy army came and they had to and they could clearly see that the Lord had preserved them and delivered them from their enemies' hands. So it's not this. It's not a nebulous thing for them, for these people, because they have lived through this. It's not a nebulous. Oh, uh, if you are good now, then one day you will go to heaven and be blessed there. It's like you are living this way. You have seen the results for yourselves right now.
That is true. And he points it out.
Yeah. I say unto you that the man that doeth this, the same cometh out in open rebellion against God. Therefore he listeth to obey the evil spirit, and becometh an enemy to all righteousness. Therefore the Lord hath no place in him, for he dwelleth not in unholy temples. And I do also like the fact that, I mean, so many people nowadays, they always put all the blame on God. And they always say, oh, the Lord withdraws from you, or all these sayings. And, King Benjamin, that's another reason why he's obviously a good teacher, because he doesn't have to dumb it down for them. He can say that, yes, this is your fault. Yes, the Lord always loves you, but you're the one withdrawing from him. You are the one who became an enemy to him. It's not him doing it to you. And the fact that he can say this is uh, outright is obvious the fact that he has already taught them a lot.
He was quite, he was quite trusted by his people, so he can be very blunt like that.
Yeah, he is very blunt at times. Even if, I mean, in modern day, if a lot of people who read this and don't understand it, they just see it as the same thing as always. But I think at this point in time, the people he's talking to understood this. And I don't know, you can always tell, like when the Lord always spoke in parables, and it always shows, not just the disciples and other people. It says, well, what does that mean? Well, what does that mean? And it's, how does that relate to the punishment and reward? And even later on, I mean, in other parts of the Book of Mormon, there are always spots where you can tell that they're starting from the basics. And it's like, yes, the Lord will punish you if you do this, and yes, you will be rewarded in heaven and everything else. And but in this specific speech, at least, I think they are a lot more advanced in the gospel than a lot of times when people have had to make speeches like this. So
Of course.
it's always interesting to think about, to look at this and try and see the context of why he's saying this in this way and everything else.
Absolutely. I think that some of these things, like if I can kind of go on one of the tangents here a little bit, I find it interesting how he's pointing out this, cause and effect. You behave like this, you've gotten this type of blessings in your life, and he's pointing it out, and he's pointing out the cause and effect that if you take upon yourself these vices, eventually, storms will come, those vices will shift within you, and you're going to list that direction. And the storm gets too bad, you'll be overcome, like he says,
Yeah,
and things like that. And he points to me, he points out these things very well. But some, like for myself, I have people who say, why am I getting this effect in my life? I'm following the commands, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Why am I still having this bad effect in my life? And really, there's only a couple of answers to that. And one is something you're doing is incorrect,
yeah.
or you're
You're either not keeping the commandments in some way, or you have something in you, like the shifted karga. There is something that you see as small, uh,
that you
but
see
is
as
teach
insignificant,
that you
and
see as insignificant,
sometimes you even think it's a good thing.
or see as a good thing, but it's leading you, it's
Okay,
causing you to list, and
you're getting bad
you're
results
going
from
into bad wet, and you're getting the bad results.
it.
So it's
And when you point it out to them, that's when you can see if they're humble enough to accept it or not. And usually it's not. And usually they will dance around it until you find it because they know what it is.
yeah.
And oftentimes, if you tell them it's because, if you tell them it's because you begrudge somebody giving you a present on your birthday, they're like, what? When did I ever do that?
Yep.
But if you say, oh, it's because of this other thing, they already have prepared within them 1,000 excuses, reasons,
Excuse.
justifications, and everything under the sun, and they already have them well prepared. And they can tell you they have that defense ready, prepared. They've said it over and over again in their heads. They know exactly what it is.
Yeah.
But if you tell them it's something silly like, uh, you didn't make your shoes crooked when you put them on the mat, they'll be like, what? Right? They don't have a defense prepared for it,
Yeah.
but they do have a defense prepared for something they already knew was wrong. And they've justified it. So it's pretty easy to see. And it's also
Yeah.
easy to see if you say, well, when you interact over here, you always give an excuse for what you did or something. Even just making something up, whatever it may be. And because you always make excuses, that's why you get this other result. And they say, that doesn't make sense because they can't see how the two connect.
Yeah.
And of course, you have to be kind of mean to them and say, that is right. You cannot see. That's why you can't fix it. But it doesn't matter if you can't see or can't. Trust the Lord and do it anyway.
Yeah.
But they won't humble themselves to do it just because they are not intelligent enough to see the connection.
Yeah.
They think, therefore, God can't see the connection.
Yeah. And even if they can see the connection, there's often the uh like they are comfortable in their situation, even if there are lots of things that annoy them and they don't like and everything else. That's they are not annoyed by it enough to actually change their routine. I've seen that before when they seen someone who has a specific problem, and I say, well, it's because of this, and I even sort of take them to a step-by-step process, and it's like, well, from this to this and this, and they say, well, yeah, I guess I can see it, but I don't want to stop my bad habits. That that's the
That's always the way it is.
it's it's always best when they, at the very least, they say it outright, and it's like, yeah, but I don't want to change my lifestyle, so thanks, but no thanks.
There you go. But at least they're being honest.
Yeah. Although there is every once in a while when I can show them a connection they didn't know existed, and as long as it's something small enough that they just need to shift their routine just a few inches, and then they do it, and they're like, hey, that actually worked. So
Yep.
they won't shift any more than that, but sometimes they will,
Yeah.
and you know it'll
Absolutely.
give them just that little bit better.
Yep. And that's what I think King Benjamin's trying to do.
Yep. Yep. Well, uh, okay. Well, I want to read the rest of
Okay.
this paragraph here. We're getting close to 8 o'clock, but where this verse? Yeah. But I want to read this next one. It says, therefore, if that man repenteth not, and remaineth and dieth an enemy to God, the demands of divine justice doth awaken his immortal soul to a lively sense of his own guilt, which doth cause him to shrink from the presence of the Lord, and doth fill his breast with guilt and pain and anguish, which is like an unquenchable fire, whose flames ascendeth up for ever and ever. And now I say unto you that mercy hath no claim on that man. Therefore his final doom is to endure a never-ending torment. Now I like this one because it very clearly defines what hell is. And it says it's right away. God isn't kicking you out or anything else. It's the fact that when you die and you get that sense of your own guilt. You see exactly everything that you have done and all the consequences for it. And it causes him to shrink from the presence of the Lord. You run away. You leave the Lord. It's not, and the guilt and pain and anguish is that unquenchable fire, that fires of hell that everyone else speaks of.
All because they didn't want to change their life.
Yeah, says it right out that mercy has no claim on that man. That what did we just talk about a few meetings ago? Um, the atonement. the atonement has no claim on him because there's nothing, because he's already,
refuses to repent.
yeah. So no matter how much the Lord reaches out for you after that, you are the one who shrinks away.
You're the one saying no. The Lord's constantly saying, just shift your life like this.
Yep,
You're saying, no, I'm comfortable.
yep. Yeah, and he goes on, but maybe we can save that for next meeting. But yeah, well, what did
A lot of
everybody
good stuff
think?
here.
Yep. What did everybody think about the first part of the speech?
Powerful stuff, I think. It really gives a whole gospel buffet right there.
Yep. Yeah, well, I like it because it's a talk already written. Somebody else already wrote it.
Yep.
It was one of the few talks in the Book of Mormon that did not get edited much. I think Mormon wrote it down. He wasn't going to mess with it. And it goes through a lot of feast terminology and atonement and Sukkot reference. No, it's great stuff.
Yep, absolutely. There's obviously a reason that when Mormon was doing the editing or condensing, he kept that speech in. I don't know if it was in its entirety, but
Looks
but
pretty close.
it's very complete and coherent. Like it looks like he took the whole thing and just brought it over because it was such a complete it was a complete well, it was a complete talk.
It has the whole gospel in it.
It
It's
has
very nice.
it has the whole gospel is explained in that one talk.
Yep.
Very nice. Very nice.
Yep. Did anyone else have any other comments? No. You're allowed to talk.
Well, we should ask for a volunteer for a closing prayer then.
Yep. Any volunteers for the closing prayer?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you that we can have this meeting. Thank you that we can share and learn the gospel. Please close this meeting and please bless that your angels will be around us. In the name of Yeshua Messiah, Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Yeah.
Very good.